Take your hand off my chair. Ethan Parker did not raise his voice, but the young hotel employee immediately froze with one hand resting on the handle of Ethan's wheelchair. The polished lobby of the Meridian Crown seemed to grow quieter around them. I was only trying to move you away from the desk, sir, the employee said. Ethan looked directly at him. Then you asked first. The employee withdrew his hand and apologized before stepping away. Ethan turned back toward the marble reception counter, where Assistant Manager Marcus Reed stood with the carefully patient expression of someone who believed the conversation should already be over. Ethan had arrived 20 minutes earlier expecting a simple check-in before the Foundation Gala that evening. Instead, he had learned that the accessible suite he reserved 3 weeks ago had been reassigned. Mr. Parker, Marcus said, as I explained, we had an unexpected change in room availability. Ethan placed his phone on the counter with his confirmation visible. My reservation specifically confirms an accessible suite. I understand. Then why was it given to someone else? Marcus hesitated. A priority guest required accommodation on that floor. Ethan studied him. And that made my confirmed reservation optional? That is not what I said. It is what happened. Several guests nearby glanced toward the counter. Marcus lowered his voice. We have offered you another room. A room without the accessibility features I reserved. We can have staff assist you if necessary. Ethan's expression tightened. Staff assistance is not a substitute for an accessible room. Marcus drew a slow breath. There is another hotel approximately 8 blocks from here. We could inquire about transferring your reservation. Have you confirmed they have an accessible room? Marcus paused again. Not yet. Ethan leaned back slightly in his wheelchair. He could have ended the problem with one phone call. Adrian and Julian Cole had enough influence within Cole Hospitality to make half the management team appear in the lobby within minutes. But Ethan had made the reservation under his own name for a reason. He wanted the same service. Any guest with a confirmed booking should receive, not special treatment, because of the men he had married. I'm not leaving until you explain why my room was reassigned, Ethan said. Marcus glanced toward the growing line behind him. Mr. Parker, we're trying to resolve this without disrupting other guests. There it was. Ethan was no longer a guest with a problem. He had become a problem. Then resolve it, Ethan replied calmly. Show me what accessible rooms are available tonight. Marcus turned his monitor slightly away. I have already reviewed our inventory. Ethan caught the movement reflected in the polished brass panel behind the desk. For only a second, he saw the reservation screen clearly enough to notice a room category marked available. Executive Accessible Suite. His eyes returned to Marcus. You said there were no accessible rooms. None available for reassignment. That is different. Marcus's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Ethan looked again at the reflected screen, then back at him. The room existed. It was empty, and for reasons Marcus had not explained, someone had already decided Ethan was not important enough to receive it. Ethan kept his eyes on Marcus. What exactly does unavailable for reassignment mean? Marcus straightened behind the counter. The executive suite is being held for priority arrivals. So it is empty. At the moment, yes. And it has the accessibility features listed in my reservation. Marcus hesitated just long enough to answer the question without speaking. Ethan nodded. Then you have an accessible room. You have simply decided I cannot have it. A few people waiting behind Ethan became noticeably quieter. Marcus glanced toward them before lowering his voice. The executive suite is reserved for guests with certain status requirements. I had a status requirement. It was called a confirmed reservation. Marcus's practiced smile disappeared. Mr. Parker, I understand you are frustrated. I'm not asking you to understand my feelings. I am asking you to honor the reservation your hotel accepted. Marcus looked toward the receptionist beside him. Could you please check whether the Midtown property has an accessible king available? Ethan immediately stopped him. Do not transfer anything. The receptionist froze. Ethan continued. You have not explained why I should travel another 8 blocks because someone else wanted the room I already reserved. Marcus folded his hands on the counter. We are trying to find a reasonable solution. Then start with the room upstairs. Marcus shook his head. That suite cannot be released. Cannot or will not. Marcus did not answer. Ethan felt his phone vibrate in his jacket pocket. He glanced down and saw a message from Julian asking whether he had checked in yet. Ethan did not respond. One message could bring both twins downstairs if they were already at the property, and one mention of the Cole name would probably change the entire conversation. That was precisely why Ethan refused to use it. He wanted to know what happened when the person at this counter was simply Ethan Parker, a guest whose reservation should have been enough. Marcus looked toward the line again. If you would move to the seating area, I can continue investigating while we assist the other guests. Ethan's gaze sharpened. I am waiting for my check-in to be completed. I am not moving somewhere less visible because this conversation is inconvenient. Marcus's face tightened. Nobody said that. Then there should be no problem with me staying here. Before Marcus could respond, the revolving doors at the far end of the lobby opened. Ethan recognized Adrian first, tall and composed in a dark suit, with Julian beside him. They had apparently arrived earlier than Ethan expected. Julian spotted Ethan almost immediately and started toward the desk. Ethan gave him a small, deliberate shake of his head. Julian stopped. Adrian followed his brother's gaze, understood the signal, and remained beside him. Neither approached. Marcus noticed the two men, but clearly did not notice the silent exchange. His expression transformed into professional warmth. He stepped slightly around Ethan's position and addressed the twins from across the lobby. Gentlemen, welcome to the Meridian Crown. Someone will assist you immediately. Ethan watched Julian's jaw tighten. Adrian remained unreadable. Marcus glanced at Ethan as though explaining an unfortunate delay. I apologize that you have had to witness this difficult guest situation. Julian looked directly at Ethan. Ethan held his gaze for a moment, then gave the smallest nod. The permission had finally been given. Adrian and Julian crossed the lobby without hurrying. Marcus seemed relieved, apparently believing two important arrivals had given him an excuse to end the argument. Gentlemen, he said, if you will come this way, we can complete your check-in immediately. Adrian stopped several feet from the counter. We are not checking in yet. Marcus blinked. Julian continued toward Ethan until he stood beside his wheelchair, careful not to touch it. Adrian took the other side. Marcus looked between the three men, confusion replacing his polished smile. Is there a problem? Adrian asked. Marcus recovered quickly. Only a reservation complication. Mr. Parker's original room became unavailable, and unfortunately, he has declined the alternatives we offered. Ethan looked at him. You offer me a room without the accessibility features I reserved in another hotel you had not contacted. Marcus shifted slightly. We were still working toward a solution. Julian glanced toward the reception monitor. What about the executive accessible suite? Marcus's expression changed. That suite is being held for priority arrivals. You told me it could not be released, Ethan said. That remains correct. Marcus turned toward the twins. There is no reason this situation should delay you. I apologize again for the inconvenience. Julian stared at him. You are apologizing to us? For having to wait while we resolve a difficult guest matter. The silence that followed was so complete that Ethan could hear the soft piano music from the far side of the lobby. Adrian's expression became colder. His name is Ethan Parker. Marcus looked uncertain. Yes, sir, I know. Julian rested one hand on the marble counter. Then use it. Marcus glanced at Ethan again. Mr. Parker, as I explained, we are doing everything reasonably possible. Julian's voice remained calm. Apparently not. Everything. Marcus frowned. I am afraid I do not understand. Julian looked at Ethan first. Ethan gave him the slightest nod. Only then did Julian turn back to Marcus. Ethan Parker is our husband. Marcus stopped moving. The receptionist beside him looked up from her keyboard. Several guests nearby openly turned toward the counter. Marcus stared first at Julian, then Adrian, then Ethan. Your husband? Adrian answered quietly. Yes. Recognition appeared almost instantly. The Cole name did not merely belong to two wealthy guests. Adrian and Julian were senior figures within the hospitality group connected to the Meridian Crown. Marcus's entire manner changed. Mr. Parker, I sincerely apologize. There has clearly been a misunderstanding. Ethan said nothing. Marcus turned quickly toward the receptionist. Release the executive accessible suite. Upgrade Mr. Parker immediately, with no additional charge. The receptionist began typing. Julian looked at Ethan, expecting relief. Instead, Ethan felt something colder settle inside him. The room that could not be released 30 seconds earlier was suddenly available. Nothing about his reservation had changed. Nothing about his wheelchair had changed. Only Marcus's knowledge of who stood beside him had changed. Please, Marcus said, forcing a reassuring smile. Allow us to make this right. Ethan looked directly at him. Would you be making it right if they were not standing here? Marcus's smile disappeared. Ethan continued before either twin could speak. I was Ethan Parker before you knew who my husbands were. My reservation was confirmed before they walked through those doors. So tell me why I became worth accommodating only after you recognized them. Marcus opened his mouth, but no answer came. Marcus finally looked away. Mr. Parker, I understand why you are upset. Ethan held his gaze. That still does not answer my question. Before Marcus could respond, a woman in a charcoal suit approached from the elevators with purposeful steps. I am Rebecca Lawson, the general manager. I was informed there was a reservation issue. Marcus immediately turned toward her. Ms. Lawson, we have resolved it. Mr. Parker is being upgraded to the executive accessible suite. Rebecca looked at Ethan rather than Marcus. Has it been resolved? Ethan appreciated the question. My room problem has been resolved. The reason it happened has not. Rebecca nodded once. Then please tell me what happened. Ethan explained the confirmed accessible reservation, the reassignment, the unsuitable replacement, the suggestion that he travel 8 blocks to another hotel without a confirmed accessible room, and the executive suite Marcus refused to release until Adrian and Julian arrived. Rebecca listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, Marcus said there were operational considerations involving a priority guest. Adrian's expression tightened. What considerations make a confirmed accessibility requirement negotiable? Marcus glanced toward him. Mr. Cole, I can explain the circumstances privately. Ethan immediately responded. You can explain them here. They happened to me. Julian remained silent beside Ethan, but his expression showed approval. Rebecca turned toward Marcus. Who authorized the reassignment? Marcus hesitated. I did. Adrian started to speak, but Ethan raised one hand. Adrian stopped. Nobody is making an employment decision in this lobby because they are angry, Ethan said. Marcus looked surprised. Ethan continued. I want the reservation history preserved. I want to know who changed what, when they changed it, and why. Rebecca nodded. That is reasonable. Julian asked, can the audit record be altered after the fact? Not without leaving another record, Rebecca replied. But I will have the complete history preserved immediately. Marcus tried again. I assure everyone this was simply a judgment call made during a busy arrival period. Ethan looked at him. Then the record should support that. Rebecca stepped behind the reception counter and asked the receptionist to open Ethan's reservation history. The young woman typed carefully, then stopped. Her expression changed. Ms. Lawson, Rebecca moved closer. What did you find? There's an internal note attached to the room reassignment. Marcus became completely still. Ethan noticed before Rebecca even looked at him. Who entered it? She asked. The receptionist studied the screen. The change was processed at 4:17 this afternoon. The note was added with the authorization. Rebecca read silently for several seconds. Her face lost its professional neutrality. Do not edit, close, or modify this record, she said. Preserve a copy and restrict access until it can be reviewed. Ethan felt Julian shift beside him. Adrian's voice remained measured. What does the note say? Rebecca looked at Ethan first. I would rather discuss the exact wording somewhere private. Ethan understood immediately that whatever she had read was worse than a simple room mistake. Was my reservation changed accidentally? He asked. Rebecca paused. No. Marcus lowered his eyes. Ethan looked from him to the reservation screen. Then it was deliberate. Rebecca nodded. Yes. Ethan had expected incompetence, perhaps careless prioritization, maybe even arrogance. What he had not expected was written evidence that someone had consciously selected his reservation for sacrifice. Marcus had called it a judgment call. Now Ethan wanted to know exactly what judgment had been made about him. The exact wording of the note was waiting for Ethan upstairs. Rebecca had the executive accessible suite prepared under his original rate, and once the reservation record had been preserved, she joined Ethan, Adrian, and Julian at the dining table near the windows. Manhattan glowed beyond the glass, but nobody paid attention to the view. Rebecca placed a printed copy of the audit history on the table and turned it toward Ethan. "The reassignment was authorized at 4:17 this afternoon," she said. "A platinum-tier guest requested a room closer to his business group. Your original suite matched what they wanted." Ethan looked down at the record and the note. Rebecca paused before answering. "Parker reservation has no VIP designation. Relocation expected to create minimal service impact." For several seconds, Ethan simply stared at the words. Julian's expression hardened. Adrian remained quieter, but Ethan could see the anger in the way his shoulders became perfectly still. "Minimal service. Impact," Ethan repeated. Rebecca nodded. "That is the wording." Ethan looked toward her. "So they knew I had an accessible reservation." "Yes." They knew the replacement room did not have the same features. "The record indicates that information was visible." Ethan leaned back. The problem had never been that the hotel did not understand what he needed. Someone had understood and decided another guest mattered more. Julian finally spoke. "I want every reservation Marcus touched reviewed." Ethan turned toward him. "Not just Marcus." Julian frowned. Ethan reached for his phone. "There is something I have not told either of you." He opened a folder containing screenshots he had saved over the previous 6 weeks. "I started noticing complaints online after a guest mentioned an accessibility problem at another Cole property." Adrian moved closer. Ethan scrolled through the messages. "Accessible rooms unavailable at arrival. Guests being offered standard rooms instead. People being told they should have called ahead even though their requirements were already attached to confirmed reservations." Rebecca studied the screen. "Are all of these from our hotels?" "Several are. I did not know whether they represented isolated mistakes, so I saved them." Julian looked at Ethan. "Why did you not tell us?" Ethan gave him a tired smile. "Because you would have called 3 executives before I finished the first sentence." Julian opened his mouth, then closed it. Adrian almost smiled despite the seriousness of the moment. "He has a point." Julian looked offended. "You would have called 4. "Probably." Ethan placed the phone beside the printed record. "Tonight changes this. I don't want to know only why my room was reassigned. I want to know how often accessible reservations are changed after confirmation and what happens to those guests." Rebecca nodded slowly. "We can begin with this property tonight and expand a review tomorrow morning." Adrian picked up the audit history. "Preserve every reason entered for an accessibility-related reassignment." Rebecca agreed. Julian leaned forward. "Until this is resolved, Ethan should have a direct manager assigned whenever he stays at one of our properties." Ethan looked at him. "No." Julian blinked. "It would prevent this from happening again." "To me?" "Yes." "And what happens to the next person who does not happen to be married to you?" Julian went silent. Ethan's voice softened. "I know you want to protect me, but if the solution is special treatment because I am your husband, then we are repeating the same mistake from the opposite direction. The hotel decided status mattered more than the reservation. I do not want my status to become the reason the system suddenly works." Adrian slowly lowered the paper. "Then we fix the system." "We investigate it first," Ethan corrected. "We do not decide the answer before we know the problem." Rebecca gathered the documents. "I will personally supervise the preliminary review." She started toward the door, then stopped when her phone vibrated. She read the message, and her expression changed. Adrian noticed immediately. "What is it?" Rebecca looked at Ethan. "Reception just checked the last 30 days at this property." Ethan felt the room become still again. "And?" Rebecca took a slow breath. "Your accessible reservation was not the first one manually reassigned this month." Julian stared at her. "How many?" Rebecca answered quietly. 4. By 9 the next morning, for questionable reassignments had become 11. Ethan sat at the center of a private conference room on the 27th floor, his wheelchair positioned comfortably beside the long table. Adrian sat on his right and Julian on his left, while Rebecca stood near a large display showing preliminary records from several Cole hospitality properties. Marcus sat across from them, looking exhausted but composed. Rebecca began carefully. We reviewed accessibility-related room changes at this property for the past 12 months, then compared the results with preliminary records from Boston, Chicago, and Washington. Ethan looked at the figures on the screen. 11 reservations, 11 that require further investigation, Rebecca clarified. Some guests received equivalent accessible rooms, and several changes appear operationally justified, but others contain language suggesting accessibility commitments were treated as secondary to loyalty status, revenue, or guest convenience. Adrian's expression tightened. Was there a company policy allowing that? No. Rebecca changed the display. That is part of the problem. There is no policy telling managers to disregard accessibility requirements, but the reservation system allows accessible inventory to be reassigned too easily. Managers are also measured heavily on premium guest satisfaction, and our training does not clearly explain what protections must take priority. Ethan turned toward Marcus. Yesterday, you said my reassignment was a judgment call. What judgment did you make? Marcus took several seconds before answering. The platinum guest had a corporate relationship with the hotel and requested a room near his business group. Your profile showed no loyalty tier, no corporate account, and no VIP designation. But it showed that I reserved an accessible suite. Yes. So why did that matter less? Marcus lowered his eyes. I believed we could solve your situation afterward. Ethan remained calm. Because you thought I would be easier to move. Marcus nodded reluctantly. Yes. Julian shifted beside Ethan, but he did not interrupt. Ethan continued. You were not comparing two equal room preferences. One guest wanted convenience. I had a confirmed accessibility requirement. I understand that now. Understanding it now does not change what happened, but it matters if you are honest about why it happened. Marcus nodded again. Rebecca closed one file. Marcus has been temporarily removed from reservation authority while the formal review continues. The employee who processed the change will also be interviewed, but we will distinguish between authorization, system weaknesses, training failures, and individual responsibility. Adrian looked toward the screen. What happens immediately? Rebecca answered. Accessible room reassignment now requires documented justification and approval from a manager who has completed accessibility training. That is a temporary safeguard until an independent specialist reviews the process. Ethan nodded. Bring actual guests with different accessibility needs into that review too. Do not design everything from a conference room. Rebecca wrote the suggestion down. Julian leaned forward. And until the review is finished, Ethan should have a designated manager whenever he stays at one of our hotels. Ethan turned toward him. We discussed this last night. I know, but after seeing 11 cases, I would feel better knowing someone was responsible for making sure this never happens to you again. Ethan studied him. You would feel better. Julian immediately realized what he had said. That came out wrong. It came out honestly. Ethan's voice remained gentle. You want to protect me because yesterday scared you. I understand, but you are still trying to redesign my experience around your fear. Julian looked down at the table. I do not want you facing something like that alone. Then ask me what I want instead of deciding what protection should look like. Silence settled over the room. Julian finally looked at him. What do you want from me? Ethan's expression softened. Sit beside me. Listen. Let this investigation happen. If I need more, trust me enough to tell you. Julian nodded. All right. Adrian looked at Ethan before speaking. And from me? Ethan smiled faintly. The same. Rebecca's phone vibrated. She read the message and looked toward them. There's one more issue. Tonight's Foundation Gala Board has learned that an accessibility review is underway. Several members want to issue a public statement and reference the incident that triggered it. Adrian looked instinctively toward Ethan, but this time he did not answer for him. Do you want your experience included? Ethan shook his head. No. Announce the review if the company needs to announce it. Do not use me to prove the company cares. Adrian nodded. Then your name stays out of it. For the first time since Ethan entered the Meridian Crown, the people with the most power in the room were not asking how to protect him. They were learning to ask what he wanted. After the meeting, Ethan headed toward the elevators with Adrian and Julian beside him, but neither man reached for his wheelchair or tried to guide him. Julian looked, so deliberately careful that Ethan finally glanced over. You know you're allowed to walk normally. Julian gave him a wounded look. I am learning. You look like you're taking an exam. Adrian smiled. He studied all morning. Julian ignored him. When the elevator opened into the lobby, a young bell attendant approached Ethan near the control panel. Good morning, sir. Would you like assistance? Ethan looked toward the button. No, thank you. I have it. Of course. The attendant stepped aside immediately. Julian started forward by instinct, caught himself, and stopped. Ethan pressed the button, then looked back at him. That was almost impressive. Almost. You moved half a step. Adrian laughed quietly. The humor eased something that had been tight between them since the night before. On the ballroom level, Rebecca was waiting with another folder. The independent accessibility firm accepted the review, she said. They can begin Monday morning. Ethan nodded. Good. They also recommended forming a guest advisory group with people who have different accessibility needs. Even better, Rebecca handed Adrian the folder. There's another complication. Several board members want tonight's announcement framed as a response to a recent guest incident. They believe a personal story would make the message stronger. Adrian did not open the folder. Ethan already answered that. Rebecca nodded. I know. I wanted you all to understand that the request is still being pushed. Ethan looked through the ballroom doors where employees were arranging tables beneath enormous chandeliers. They want a clean story. Someone was treated badly. Leadership discovered it. Leadership fixed it. That is essentially the argument, Rebecca said. But leadership did not discover the problem, Ethan replied. Guests experienced it. Some complained. The company failed to recognize the pattern. Julian's expression became serious. Then, that is what the statement should say. Ethan looked at him. Julian raised both hands slightly. Suggestion, not decision. Ethan smiled. Progress. Rebecca's phone vibrated. She read the message. The preliminary search has expanded beyond the 11 reservations. The outside firm asked us to preserve records from every property before Monday. Adrian nodded. Do it. Ethan glanced at him. Adrian added, that is a company records decision. I think I'm still allowed to make those. Barely, Ethan said, and Julian laughed. Several hours later, guests began arriving for the foundation gala. Ethan entered the ballroom in his midnight blue suit with Adrian and Julian walking naturally beside him. No special escort waited. No manager hovered nearby. His place card remained exactly where it had originally been assigned. Before they reached the table, an older board member approached Adrian. We have been discussing the announcement. If Ethan sat at the front during your remarks, people would understand the company's commitment immediately. Adrian looked toward Ethan, but remained silent. The board member seemed confused by the pause. Ethan answered for himself. I would prefer to sit where my place card says. Of course, the man replied, although disappointment briefly crossed his face. After he walked away, Julian leaned toward Ethan. I wanted to answer him so badly. I know, but I did not. Would you like a certificate? Possibly. Adrian shook his head. Both of you are impossible. Rebecca approached before they could continue. This time, there was no humor in her expression. The expanded records search just returned preliminary results. Adrian looked at her. More cases? More properties? Rebecca said. Ethan felt the weight of those words immediately. The problem was growing faster than anyone had expected. Julian looked toward Ethan, clearly fighting the instinct to start proposing solutions. Then he did something different. What do you need? Ethan met his eyes. The question mattered because Julian was finally asking it before acting. Right now, Ethan said, I need you both to listen. Tonight cannot become a story about powerful alphas rescuing their husband, and it cannot become a story about one manager causing everything. If this company wants to change, it has to tell the truth even when the truth is less flattering. Adrian nodded. No hero. Ethan looked toward Rebecca. And no. Convenient villain. Rebecca understood. Then we follow the evidence wherever it leads. Ethan turned toward the crowded ballroom. Yesterday, he had entered this hotel asking for one room. Tonight, he was asking something much harder from everyone around him. Not protection, not revenge, but the courage to discover how many people had been ignored before anyone important was watching. The ballroom quieted when Adrian stepped to the microphone, but Ethan remained at his assigned table beside Julian, exactly where he had chosen to sit. Adrian waited until the room settled before speaking. This evening, Cole Hospitality authorized an independent review of accessibility practices across our properties. A few board members shifted in their seats. Adrian continued, without offering the polished explanation they had expected. Preliminary information indicates that some confirmed accessibility requirements may not have received the protection our guests reasonably expected. We do not yet know the full scope, and we will not pretend otherwise. Ethan watched him carefully. There was no mention of yesterday, no reference to Ethan, and no attempt to turn one humiliating experience into proof of corporate virtue. The review will examine reservation controls, staff training, management incentives, complaint handling, and accessible inventory procedures, Adrian said. Guests with lived experience will participate in that process. Findings will be reviewed independently, and recommendations will not be limited to what is convenient for management. Julian leaned slightly toward Ethan. He changed the speech. Ethan kept his eyes on Adrian. Good. The applause that followed was respectful rather than celebratory, which Ethan thought was appropriate. Nothing had been fixed yet. Rebecca joined them several minutes later, carrying an updated summary. The preservation request reached every property, she said. The early pattern is becoming clearer. Adrian returned to the table. What does it show? Rebecca lowered her voice. Marcus was not following an official policy, but he was not operating in isolation either. Several managers interpreted premium guest satisfaction targets as permission to move reservations they believed could be resolved afterward. Accessible inventory was not sufficiently protected by the booking system. Julian frowned. So firing Marcus would have changed almost nothing. It would have addressed one decision-maker, Rebecca said, not the conditions that allowed similar decisions elsewhere. Ethan nodded. Then do not make him the ending of the story. Rebecca opened the summary. The board has approved temporary safeguards while the outside review proceeds. Accessible room reassignments will require documented justification. Staff will receive updated training. The company will establish an advisory group, and the technology team will examine whether confirmed accessibility features can be protected from routine inventory changes. Adrian looked toward Ethan. Anything missing? Ethan considered the question. A way for guests to report a problem without having to fight through 3 levels of management. Rebecca wrote it down. Agreed. Julian smiled faintly. You realize they're going to keep asking you questions now. Questions are fine, Ethan replied. It is answers people keep trying to give for me that cause trouble. Julian accepted the correction without defensiveness. Later, as the gala began winding down, Marcus approached their table with Rebecca several feet behind him. He looked nervous but composed. Mr. Parker, may I speak with you? Ethan nodded. Marcus stopped at a respectful distance. I wanted to apologize without explaining my decision away. I saw your reservation, understood what it required, and still decided another guest status mattered more because I assumed your inconvenience would be easier to manage. That was wrong. Ethan studied him. Thank you for saying exactly what happened. Marcus seemed surprised that Ethan offered nothing more. I understand the review will determine what happens next, he said. Yes, Ethan replied. It should. Marcus nodded and left. Julian waited until he was gone. You did not forgive him. He did not ask me to. Would you? Ethan looked toward the ballroom doors. Maybe someday. Accountability and forgiveness are different things. Adrian joined them, loosening his tie slightly now that the formal program was over. Ready to leave? Ethan nodded. Outside, Manhattan had cooled under the night sky. They moved along the sidewalk together, passing bright storefronts and late-night traffic. After nearly a block, Julian spoke quietly. There is something I cannot stop thinking about. Marcus became a completely different person when he learned who we were. Ethan slowed near the corner. That is the part one cannot forget either. Adrian looked at him. Ethan continued. My reservation did not change when you walked in. My needs did not change. I did not become more deserving. Only his calculation of my importance changed. Neither twin answered immediately. Ahead of them, construction barriers narrowed the sidewalk beside a temporary curb ramp. Ethan looked toward the uneven pavement, then at the two men beside him. Julian's hand moved instinctively toward the back of the wheelchair, but before touching it, he stopped. Julian kept his hand suspended a few inches from the wheelchair handle. The temporary curb ramp ahead was usable, but construction had left one edge slightly uneven where the pavement met the street. Want a hand? He asked. Ethan looked at the ramp, then at Julian. For a moment, the question felt larger than the obstacle in front of them. Less than 2 days earlier, a hotel employee had put a hand on Ethan's chair without permission because moving him seemed easier than asking what he wanted. Now Julian, the man who loved him and had every instinct to protect him, was waiting for an answer. Ethan nodded. Yes, just steady the back while I take the front wheels over the edge. Got it. Julian placed his hands exactly where Ethan indicated. Adrian stepped aside rather than crowding them. Ethan guided the chair forward. Julian provided only the support requested, and within seconds they were safely on the level section of sidewalk. Julian immediately released the handles. Better. Perfect. Julian smiled. I passed the exam. Ethan laughed softly. You passed one question. They continued toward the intersection as traffic moved through the avenue under bright city lights. Adrian walked beside Ethan in thoughtful silence before finally speaking. I owe you an apology, too. Ethan glanced toward him. For what? For how quickly I wanted to solve everything with authority. Yesterday, my first instinct was to remove Marcus, call corporate leadership, and make sure nobody could ever put you in that position again. That sounds very much like you. Adrian smiled faintly. I thought protection meant making the problem disappear before it could reach you. Ethan slowed as they approached the crosswalk. Sometimes protection is useful. Sometimes I will ask for it. But being loved does not mean being managed. Adrian nodded. I understand that better now. Julian looked between them. We both do. Ethan studied their faces. You are probably going to forget occasionally. Definitely him, Adrian said, pointing toward Julian. Absolutely both of you, Ethan replied. Julian protested, and for the first time since arriving at the Meridian Crown, Ethan laughed without carrying the weight of the hotel lobby somewhere behind it. His phone vibrated. A message from Rebecca reported that the independent review had formally begun and that representatives from several disability advocacy organizations would be invited to participate in the advisory process. Ethan read the message aloud. Adrian asked, "Does that feel like enough?" Ethan considered it. It feels like a beginning. That was all he wanted it to be. No dramatic promise could repair a system overnight. Marcus still faced a formal review. The other reservation cases still required investigation. Policies had to change, technology had to be improved, and employees needed better guidance. Real accountability would take longer than a public apology. The pedestrian signal changed. Ethan moved into the crosswalk first, with Adrian and Julian matching his pace on either side. Halfway across, Julian said, "There's one thing about yesterday that still bothers me." "Only one?" Ethan asked. Julian ignored the joke. "When Marcus learned we were your husbands, suddenly you mattered to him." Ethan nodded. "That bothered me too." Adrian looked toward him. "You never needed our name to make you important." No. Ethan's answer came easily because that had never been the question. The problem was whether everyone else understood it. Adrian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You do not belong to us, Ethan. We belong beside you." Ethan turned toward him, surprised by the simplicity of the words. Julian nodded. "Beside you, unless you specifically request pushing privileges." Ethan laughed again. "Those privileges remain under strict review." They reached the opposite curb as the city continued around them, indifferent and bright. Ethan rolled onto the sidewalk under his own power. Adrian and Julian did not move ahead to clear his path, and they did not fall behind to watch over him. They stayed exactly where Ethan wanted them, one on either side, while he chose the direction home.